Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, Anurag, we can hear you.
Yeah. Sir, good evening. So we have this patient with SL pancreas and cholangiopathy. Dr. Jaydeep is our third-year resident who will present the case. And I think we can take up the question or discussion after that. Would that be all right, sir?
We have about 20-22 minutes of presentation, and then we leave about 7 to 8 minutes for the cases questions to be asked.
Absolutely all right. We'll finish in 20 minutes, sir. Jaydeep.
Yes, sir. Good evening. Greetings from the Santopa Institute of Gastrosciences. Today we will be discussing a patient with pancreatic as well and cholangiopathy. So here we have a 50-year-old male who presented with a complaint of jaundice for 1 to 2 years, which was persistent in nature, associated with high-colored urine and clay-colored stool. Along with that, he had itching for about 1 to 2 years, which was more in the extremities and more at night. Associated with off and on fever and pain abdomen, which was mild in intensity in the epigastric region for the last 6 months. Patient did not have any history of abdominal distension, pedal edema, altered sensorium, hematemesis, melena or bleeding PR. No history of diarrhea, vomiting, joint pains, bony pains, ecchymosis, fatigue, ataxia. No history of any alternative medicine intake, blood transfusion, tattooing or high-risk sexual behavior. No history of biliary colics, and no history suggestive of eye pain, redness in the eye, and skin lesion. Patient had past history of diabetes and hypertension for the last 2 years. Now visiting the patient's timeline. Patient presented with obstructive jaundice, which was suggested by a total bilirubin of 4.2, of a direct component of 3.8, a raised alkaline phosphatase of 387, and a raised total count of 12,500. Patient underwent some transabdominal ultrasound, and for reasons not known to the patient as well as to us, he was subjected to an explorative laparotomy. During the surgery, the patient had changes of chronic pancreatitis, and the surgery was abandoned. And the patient was referred to a tertiary care center in Jaipur for ERCP and stenting. Patient underwent the ERCP and stenting every 3 monthly. And going by that, along with obstructive jaundice, it is suggestive that the patient has a likely benign biliary stricture, and he underwent a dilatation for that. And in 2018, patient shifted to Mumbai and again consulted a tertiary care center where he was investigated in the form of a PET CT, which was suggestive of bulky pancreas and showed ill-defined mass lesion in the head of pancreas. Moreover, CBD stent was seen in situ with dilatation of IHBR. LFT, which was repeated, had similar findings. TLC, however, were normal, and the serum IgG4 level was done, which was normal. A patient was not subjected to any other investigation in the form of an endoscopic ultrasound or other blood investigation, and patient was subjected to a Whipple surgery. The surgical biopsy was suggestive of an autoimmune pancreatitis type 1, which was IgG4 related. Patient remained relatively asymptomatic for the following year, but later started developing itching again and associated with a cumulative weight loss of around 25 kg over the past 3 years, and fever, which was off and on. Patient then presented at our center with these complaints. On physical examination, a patient had a grossly normal findings except for the surgical star marks over the abdomen. So the treating unit had a working diagnosis of an autoimmune pancreatitis with obstructive jaundice. At our center, the patient was evaluated in the form of LFT, which was suggested a normal bilirubin, but a significantly raised alkaline phosphatase and a normal total count. The viral markers in the form of HPSAG, HCV, and HIV were negative. A fibroscan was of 8.3. The patient later was subjected to an MRCP and a liver biopsy. These are the images of the MRCP, in which we can appreciate that this is the hepatico-jejunal anastomotic site, which appears to be grossly normal without any anastomotic stricture. But here we can appreciate a long stricture, intrahepatic stricture, followed by a proximal IHBR dilatation. And this finding can be seen in almost all the cuts of the MRCP. So we have a narrowing of the right main hepatic duct, a proximal part and proximal part of the segment 4 duct with multifocal narrowing in bilateral IHBR and a mild IHBR dilatation and a periportal altered signal intensity in segment 4, possibility of sclerosing cholangitis. The liver biopsy, which the patient underwent, also showed in a low power field, it shows the core of the liver tissues, which has an adequate portal tract, which can be appreciated here. And on amplifying this portal tract, we can see that there is an expansion of the portal tract. And on further high power field, we can see that this is the portal vein, this is the hepatic artery, and this is the bile duct. And we can see here some concentric thickening around the bile duct. And these are the inflammatory cells, predominantly lymphocytes, along with few neutrophils and eosinophils. The biopsy was subjected to immunomarkers for plasma cells, and it came out to be negative. Patient was it was also subjected to a IgG4 level, which was also negative. So in one portal tract, one small bile duct showed a concentric sclerosis, and the rest of them showed inflammatory infiltrates. So the pathologist gave a possibility of primary sclerosing cholangitis. Diagnosis. We have two possible diagnoses here. First is autoimmune pancreatitis with IgG4 cholangiopathy, and second is autoimmune pancreatitis with a completely different etiology, or that is primary sclerosing cholangitis. So why did we take this case for discussion is because we have two issues here. First is all masses of pancreas are not adenocarcinoma, and how to differentiate between IgG4 cholangiopathy from a primary sclerosing cholangitis. So we'll be discussing both of this one by one. Coming on to the first issue, so the SOL of pancreas. So the most common etiologies mimicking pancreatic adenocarcinoma are a mass-forming chronic pancreatitis, a focal autoimmune pancreatitis, a paraduodenal or groove pancreatitis, a pancreatic tuberculosis, a pancreatic lymphoma, and a pancreatic NET. In a study, about 5 to 35% of the patients who underwent a Whipple's procedure had a biopsy, means pathologic diagnosis of a non-neoplastic inflammatory pancreatic mass. So, what is the approach to differentiate an inflammatory pancreatic SOL from a pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma? So, if we find a focal mass which is present in an imaging study, then we have to look for a duct penetrating through the mass sign, hypodense fibrotic rim around the mass, displacement of a gastroduodenal artery and/or the CVD, a loss of lobulations, necrotic lymph nodes, and preserved planes between the mass and vessels or CBD. If we find these findings along with a focal mass, then the possibility of inflammatory mass is likely. Whereas if there is encasement of vessels, extrapancreatic invasion, dilated upstream of NCD, then the possibility of pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma is likely. So what are the basic investigations that should be done in the patient before moving forward? So serum CA19-9 levels, CECT abdomen, if required with a pancreatic protocol, MRI of the abdomen, US guided FNA or FND, a PET CT, and a DOTA-NOC, depending on the patient's presentation and other investigation. Out of this, the US guided FNA or FND is the most sensitive and specific, with a sensitivity of 94 and a specificity of almost 100%. So algorithm to approach a pancreatic mass. If we suspect a pancreatic mass, then the patient is subjected either a CT or an MRI. If we find a pancreatic mass, then the patient, and if we aren't sure of the etiology, then the US guided FNA or a CT guided biopsy should be done. If the results are ambiguous or we have a strong suspicion and cannot find a mass on a CT or MRI, then the patient must undergo an US followed by a US FNA. And if that is non-diagnostic, then the patient should be subjected to a US guided FNA. As we can see in our patient, CA19-9 levels and US FNA or FND was not done, which should have been done to confirm the etiology, and the patient was directly subjected to a surgical procedure. Now coming on to second topic of discussion, that is IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis. So it is associated with autoimmune pancreatitis in about 80 to 90% of the cases. And it is important to differentiate IgG4 cholangiopathy from a malignant etiology like cholangiocarcinoma, pancreas cancer, or a benign counterpart like primary sclerosing cholangitis. The nomenclature has been changed from IgG4 associated cholangitis to IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis. So epidemiologically, the prevalence of IgG4 is related sclerosing cholangitis is unknown. The mean age is around 66 years with a range of 23 to 88 years, and it is a male predominant disease. Clinical presentation is obstructive jaundice, pruritus, abdominal pain, and weight loss. And in a study by a Japanese cohort, almost 28% of the patients were asymptomatic at the time of diagnosis, and almost 90 were seen to have autoimmune pancreatitis, and in only 10% of the cases, isolated IgG4 sclerosing cholangitis was appreciated. Now, coming on to the different types of
I can't hear anything.
I think we lost connection with Dr. Jaydeep. Dr. Jaydeep, if I am audible to you, just stop sharing your video, then continue.
Jaydeep, is Akshay there? I'll just call Jaydeep and get it started again. I don't know what's the problem. Can you hear me?
Ask him to switch off his video.
Yes, sir. I'll just do that. Can you just read out his slides, Akshay, from here? Can you go to the next one?
They're basic. Yeah, sir. This one, no?
Yeah.
There are four types. Yes, sir. Four types of IgG. Yes, sir.
Go to the slide share mode.
Okay, sir.
Jaydeep, is there anyone else in your room with the
No, sir.
application open?
Sorry, sir.
Is there anyone
There should be
else?
no other device in your room. There should be no
No,
other
sir.
device in your room.
No, sir. No, sir.
All right. Okay.
Sir, are my slides visible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry for the delay. So, coming back to the different types of IgG4 related cholangitis, type 1 is when there is a stenosis involved only in the lower part of the CBD, with a differential, which includes a differential diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, a bile duct cancer, and a chronic pancreatitis. And the useful modalities include an intraductal ultrasound, US guided FNA, and a biopsy of the bile duct. Type 2, it includes an extended narrowing of the intrahepatic bile duct, which in type 2A, there is a pre-stenotic dilatation of the intrahepatic bile duct, whereas in type 2B, there is a long extended narrowing in the intrahepatic bile duct without pre-stenotic dilatation. And this should be differentiated from a primary sclerosing cholangitis. And the useful modalities include a liver biopsy and a colonoscopy to rule out any features of IBD. Type 3 and type 4, these include the stenosis in the hepatic hilar region. In type 3, it is associated with the lower end CBD stenosis, whereas in type 4, only hepatic hilar region stenosis is seen. And this should be differentiated from a bile duct cancer and a gallbladder cancer. And the useful modalities include an US intraductal ultrasound and a biopsy. Coming on to the classifications, diagnostic criteria. First is the Japanese one, which includes a biliary tract imaging, which reveals a diffuse or segmental narrowing of the intrahepatic and the extrahepatic bile duct associated with a thickening of the bile duct wall. Serum IgG4 levels of more than 135, coexistence of autoimmune pancreatitis and IgG4 related other organ involvement, and some histopathological findings, which we'll be studying in the subsequent slides. The second diagnostic criteria is the HISORT criteria, which we are all familiar with. The first one includes histology, second is imaging, third is serology, fourth is other organ involvement, and fifth is steroid response to steroid therapy. So coming on to the first topic in the HISORT criteria, it includes lymphoplasmacytic infiltrates with IgG4 plasma cells, in which both B and T lymphocytes are present. With the T lymphocytes often outnumber the B lymphocytes, associated with storiform fibrosis and or obliterative phlebitis. It is the gold standard, and the resected specimen provides the best material for staining. The immunostaining for IgG4 reveals a diffuse and abundant infiltrates with more than 50 IgG4 plasma cells in a surgical specimen and more than 10 in per high power field on biopsy. And IgG4 to IgG1 ratio of more than 0.4 helps to differentiate it from a cholangiocarcinoma. So coming on to the second, that is imaging modality. The first is the transabdominal ultrasound, which has a low sensitivity. Thickened wall is seen in about, by the thickening is seen in about 14% of patients. Space occupying lesion in liver and pancreas in about 33, and dilatation of the ISBR in about 85%. Endoscopic ultrasound, we can see thickening of the bile duct in about 94% of the patient, and it is helpful to differentiate it from cholangiocarcinoma. In pancreas, we can find a diffuse bulky pancreas with surrounding hypoechoic halo. So these are the findings on EUS of, we can see a homogeneous infiltration of the body of pancreas with a normal pancreatic duct. And we can also appreciate a focal irregular hypoechoic mass in the head of pancreas with a dilated common bile duct. Coming on to MRCP, we can find concentric bile duct wall thickening with smooth inner or outer margin. Visible bile duct is in strictured segment with mild upper duct dilatation. A continuous thickening of the intra and extrahepatic bile ducts and a circular or smooth thickening highlights the transmural nature of the inflammation with preservation of the epithelial layer. Unlike in the PSC or cholangiocarcinoma, in which the epithelial layer is involved and there is an asymmetrical thickening. Coming on to PET scan, so it provides both anatomical as well as the metabolic information, and it also there is an increased SUV uptake in the affected bile duct and useful for detecting other organ involvement and monitoring the response to steroids. In a study by Zheng et al., who studied 35 patients, almost 97% had multi-organ involvement. And after 2 to 4 weeks of steroid treatment, 72% went in complete remission. Coming on to intraductal ultrasound, we can see that in IgG4 sclerosing cholangitis, there is a symmetrical, smooth, homogeneous thickening of the stenotic area with a preservation of all the three layers, as compared to TSC, where there is an asymmetrical, irregular, diverticular-like outpouching and heterogeneous thickening. And in non-stenotic area also, there is mild thickening, which is concentric, which is seen in the IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis. Coming on to ERCP and cholangioscopy, the biliary brushing and transpapillary biliary biopsy can be done with a sensitivity of 18 to 88%. Cholangioscopy visualizes the mucous membrane of the bile duct, and when combined with an MPI, can also characterize to the blood vessels of the bile duct. It also shows dilated tortuous vessels and no obvious fibrous scars. The cholangioscopic visualization and guided biopsy have a higher sensitivity than the brushing and transpapillary biopsies. And the modalities like FISH and other techniques can be used to further study these cholangioscopic biopsies, and we can still get the perfect diagnosis. Coming on to the serology part, there is an elevated IgG4 levels in about 90% of the patients. In type 1 and type 2, the cutoff is 135 to differentiate, whereas in type 3 and type 4, there is a bit higher cutoff of 207, with a specificity of 100% to rule out of cholangiocarcinoma. Now, how to differentiate between IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis and primary sclerosing cholangitis? So we have in IgG4 patients are generally middle aged as compared to PSC, where they are young patients. Both have male predominance. The chief the presenting complaint in IgG4 is obstructive jaundice, whereas in PSC there is a cholestatic liver injury. In serum IgG4 levels are higher in IgG4 as compared to PSC. And associated diseases are diabetes and IgG4 related other organ involvement, whereas in PSC there is an association with IBD. Cholangiogram, there is a long stricture of lower CVD, whereas in PSC there is a band-like stricture, a beaded appearance, a prune tree appearance, and a diverticular outpouching. On histology, we have a stromal inflammation in PSC, but there is no involvement of epithelial cells. Whereas in PSC, we have an inflammation of the luminal side of the bile duct as well as the epithelium, which can be noted. Treatment with steroids shows an excellent response with IgG4, and in ESC we have sodium acid, obeticholic acid, which is under study, and liver transplantation. The prognosis is good in IgG4 as compared to PSC, which is a progressive disease. Now, the differentiating features on cholangiogram. In PSC, we have a band-like stricture, which are short strictures, about 1 to 2 mm. There is a beaded appearance, that is short or annular stricture alternating with a normal or minimally dilated segment. There is a prune tree appearance, diminished arborization of the intrahepatic duct, and there is a diverticulate outpouching, which can be seen in PSC. Whereas in IgG4, there is a segmental stricture, long stricture, and the lower CBD stricture. So now coming back to our patient. So the points in favor of IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis, we had a middle-aged male who had a history of diabetes, obstructive jaundice, a surgical specimen of pancreatic head mass, which was suggestive of type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis. Coming on to the cholangiography, we have a long segmental stricture which can be appreciated in the intrahepatic bile duct with a proximal pre-stenotic dilatation, which can be readily appreciated. Moreover, the right hepatic bile duct is also stenosed, which show that there may be a hilar stricture. And moreover, the patient underwent ERCP and stenting procedure in view of obstructive jaundice, indicating that there might be a lower CVD stricture as well. Now, what about the liver biopsy? So the liver biopsy was suggestive of possibility of primary sclerosing cholangitis. So a literature study was done, and we could appreciate that in all patients who had IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis, the lesional biopsy could be taken in only 25% of those patients. Moreover, in these patients, only 60% of these patients showed a IgG4 positivity. Also, a periductular fibrosis could be present in autoimmune cholangiopathy. However, the person could not be documented by us. However, histologically, there is no way to negate a small PSC except for the fact that the fibrosis was seen in only one tract. So now combining the clinical features, evidence of IgG4 autoimmune pancreatic mass, MRCP findings, a small duct PSC becomes a remote possibility. And coming on to the Japanese diagnostic criteria we discussed. So we have a positive biliary tract imaging revealing a diffuse or segmental narrowing of intra and extrahepatic bile duct associated with thickening of the bile duct, which could be appreciated in the biopsy specimen also, that showed a concentric thickening of the bile duct. Moreover, there was a coexistence of autoimmune pancreatitis and in our patient. So that definitely fits our diagnosis. So as a treating unit, we started the patients on tablet Viceron 40 mg per day, and we are waiting for the follow-up. So the take-home message is that not all the pancreatic masses are malignant. The resection of all pancreatic mass is not the ideal way to go around unless you have used all the available resources. Differentiating between IgG4 sclerosing cholangitis and PSC is difficult but not impossible. And it is necessary to differentiate because these patients respond to IgG4 miraculously with steroids. Thank you.
I think a good case, Anurag. There are a few questions on the chat box, but before we go to that, this seems to be a real life case. I think the entity of IgG4 associated cholangiopathy is now well known, at least among the gastroenterologist fraternity. So it's unfortunate that this patient went through possibly 2 unnecessary surgeries. The first surgery for which we wrote up the details, and the second surgery which was a Whipple's procedure.
Yes.
Yeah, that is why we thought we would present this patient, sir. One was the same thing that he had a pancreatic head mass uninvestigated properly. I mean, not investigated in toto and subjected to surgery. So that error we as gastroenterologists should not be making. That was one reason. And second was that despite the histology suggesting sclerosing cholangitis, we combined everything. We had a lengthy discussion on this patient. A lot of literature search went into histology. And we still decided to give him steroids based on the Japanese criteria, which made a diagnosis of definite autoimmune cholangiopathy. We had IgG4 negative. We did not have plasma cells on the biopsy. And we still made that decision to treat him with steroids because, on contrary, the small duct changes that we saw can well be seen in autoimmune cholangiopathy. And we have 40% negativity of IgG4. and the plasma cells need not always be shown. So
There
that is
are
how we
questions on the chat box. If we can quickly take them on, like
Yes, of
IgG4
course.
levels in India.
right away, sir. Sir.
Yeah.
Jaideep, can you see the
the chat box?
questions?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yeah, my chat box is not opening. Jaideep, can you just open the chat box and
I
start
can
with the
quickly ask the questions. Is there a role for the fish technique? You did mention about the fish technique, but does that help in differentiating the two entities?
So I don't. We of course did not do, and we don't have the facility here. But probably for this patient, I would not be very keen on taking a fish also.
And then somebody has asked about IgG4 levels. What is the Indian cutoff value? Is it different from the Western world?
Not to my knowledge, sir. Jaideep, can you answer that for me?
sir. It is means as per the Indian population, we ideally should go for almost more than 2 times of the upper normal limit of the lab range. So if the lab range is about 90, then more than 180 should be the cutoff for the Indian population.
So you did show, Jaideep, that for the type 3 and type 4, the cutoff value is higher than type 1. What's the logic behind it?
Sir, in patients with cholangiocarcinoma also, we can find the IgG4 plasma cells also, IgG4 cells in the biopsy as well as in the blood sample. So it should be, it has been kept at a higher range to specifically rule out the cholangiocarcinoma in this patient.
Can you quickly tell us the second line of drugs? You are fortunate that steroid produced the response, but what are the second line drugs?
Sir, other immunomodulators like azathioprine, the patients have been tried on rituximab also, and they have shown some response with rituximab also. And immunosuppressants like azathioprine and azathioprine or 6 month.
Okay. So I think should we move on to the second presentation? There was some question about Rose method. Rose method to be used. I think again it's US related. I think most of the time. And while US may be very useful to differentiate adenocarcinoma from IgG4 disease, but I don't think Rose would have much role to play in differentiating IgG4 from primary sclerosing cholangitis.
Yes, sir.
Any comments on that?
So we have the facility of Rose, but again, I also feel the same that probably Rose would not have helped us here. We never, at least when the patient presented to us, never during the course of that follow-up that we have with us, did we suspect a malignancy in this patient. And so we never did a cytology examination and the Rose.
So there is a question which I don't have an answer. Why calcification is not seen in IgG4 disease?
Again, Jaideep, can you do that? I mean, I don't know myself why calcification is not seen. And
basically, there were changes of chronic pancreatitis initially, but after the patient underwent Whipple's, we could not appreciate any changes on the present MRCP as well as on the ultrasound on imaging after that.
All right, the question actually was that why calcification is usually not seen in IgG4 disease. Anyway, we'll move on to the second case. Let's move on to the second case.
yes, sir. Akshay.
Hello.
Akshay, just start. Yeah, Akshay.
Yeah. Are my slides visible, sir?
Yeah. Akshay, you are
Yes.
also a final year student? Are you a final year student?
Yes, sir.
So you've gone through your theory exam?
Yes, sir.
Yes, they have both gone through the theory exam, sir.
All right, okay.
Can I start?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. The second case which we are discussing is a hepatitis B virus-related acute liver failure. So we have a 30-year-old married female, 5 months amenorrhea, who presented to us on 14th of this month with chief complaints of yellowish discoloration of eyes and urine since 7 days and altered sensorium since last 1 day. The jaundice was first noted by her husband. It was progressive without fluctuation and was preceded by prodromal symptoms like anorexia, malaise, few episodes of vomiting, and 2 episodes of undocumented fever. However, There was no history of itching, clay-colored stool, pain abdomen, or awareness of any lump in the abdomen. Altered sensorium started one day before her admission. She was restless and irritable. Then she became disoriented and started talking irrelevantly. There was no history of abdominal surgery, jaundice or liver disorder in the past, jaundice in the family members or neighborhood, headache, cough, dysuria, hematemesis or blood in stool, abdominal distension, decreased urine output, joint pain, oral ulcers, tattooing, dental surgery, high-risk sexual behavior, complementary and alternate medication intake, and there was no history of diabetes, hypertension, tuberculosis, or any other chronic illnesses. Obstetric history, she was G3P2L2. First delivery was a normal vaginal delivery done 5 years back. It was institutional and uncomplicated. Second delivery was a cesarean section 3 years back. Again, it was uncomplicated, but she was given 2 units of packed red blood cells before her surgery, and there was no history of jaundice in any of her previous pregnancies. She was non-smoker, no history of alcohol intake with regular bowel and bladder habits, and she was on iron and calcium supplementation, which was prescribed to her by her gynecologist. So to summarize, we have a 30-year-old female with 5-month gestation who presented to our center with complaints of painless, progressive, non-cholestatic jaundice since last 7 days, with prodromal symptoms preceding onset of jaundice and history of altered sensorium since 1 day, which is suggestive of hepatocellular jaundice. So my differentials would be, first, acute liver failure due to hepatotropic virus related, and in order of incidence, first would be hepatitis E, then hepatitis A, and hepatitis B. Second differential would be acute liver failure due to any tropical fever related illness. And third, and a very rare possibility of acute liver failure due to non-hepatotropic virus like herpes simplex or cytomegalovirus. On examination, her vitals was stable. She was afebrile. On general physical examination, icterus was present, but there was no spiral nevi, dupuytren's contracture, caput medici, pedal edema, or dilated veins on back or abdomen. On abdominal examination, there was no hepatosplenomegaly or shifting dullness. The CNS examination, GCS was E2, V2, M3. She was in grade 3 HE. It was moving all 4 limbs. Pupils were 3 mm reactive, and there was no neck rigidity, and planters were bilateral moved. So my differentials would remain the same. On investigations, we found that her hemoglobin was 11, counts were around 10,000, platelets was around 2 lakh, ESR was 15, creatinine was normal, but lactate was high. LFTs, SGOT was around 800, SGPT was 1800, bilirubin was 15.2 with a direct fraction of 10.8, albumin was 2.4, alkaline phosphatase was slightly raised, ammonia was also slightly raised, but INR was very high, 7.83. Hepatitis B surface antigen was positive, E antigen was positive, so was IgM anti-HB code. Her DNA titer were 3,90,000 international unit per ml. Hepatitis A, C, E, and HIV were negative. MP, dengue, scrub typhus were negative, and her cultures were sterile. On imaging, her sonography abdomen relieved only mild hepatosplenomegaly with normal hepatic veins and with no features of portal hypertension or ascites. On sonography fetal well-being, we saw a single live intrauterine fetus of 22-week gestation with cephalic presentation. So we calculated her prognostic scores. She fulfilled the King's College criteria as her INR was more than 6.5. Her Alfred score was high, 4, and MEL score was also high, 40. So we managed her according to the ALF protocol. We started her on antivirals. We counseled her husband and attendants regarding the possibility of liver transplantation and advised them to shift to a liver transplant center as liver transplant facility is not available at our institute. And initially they refused for liver transplantation. So motive for discussing this case is not because of any diagnostic challenge, but because of the management issues we faced in this case. It was a simple case of acute Hep B related ALF. But how to manage such patients when liver transplant is refused? Because it is a common scenario, especially in India, when the patients cannot afford a liver transplant. Beyond liver transplant, we have only a few limited options. Should we continue with the standard medical therapy? Or we be a little more aggressive and consider therapeutic plasma exchange given the seriousness of our prognostic scores and the seriousness of the patient. And especially our patient was also pregnant. So whatever we decided would have implications on both the mother as well as the fetus. So we finally did plasma exchange for her. We could do only 2 sessions of plasma exchange because on day 4, our patient finally decided.
One question, Akshay, before you proceed.
Yes.
Do you think it's an acute hepatitis B or you think it's a reactivation of hepatitis B? Because one thing which was striking was your HBV DNA was high.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It was a bit high, but there was no features of chronic liver disease and there was no history suggestive of chronic illness. And her E antibody was also negative, sir.
Mm-hmm. Because
So-
usually in acute fulminant
Yeah.
liver failure due to B,
There's a-
your HBV DNA should not be so high. That's one
Yes,
of the
sir.
way of differentiating acute from reactivation.
Yes, sir. Actually, it's 5.2 log units. Sir. If it's more than that, then it is a chronic, which is a reactivation. Sir.
Okay, carry on.
So we did only 2 sessions of plasma exchange for her because her patient's her attendants finally decided to shift her to a liver transplant center. After 2 sessions, there was some improvement in her GCS. She became E4, E3, V4, and M6. She was drowsy but arousable and had started following verbal commands. Her INR also improved from 7.8 to 2.36. So a few days back, we followed up on her. We called her husband, and he informed her that she was doing well. She had been shifted to a general ward, and she did not require any further sessions of plasma exchange in that liver transplant center. So through this case, we would like to discuss 2 practical points. First, the therapeutic plasma exchange in ELF, and secondly, antivirals in pregnancy. The role of plasmapheresis. The exact pathophysiology for development of multi-organ dysfunction in ALF remains elusive. The proposed mechanisms include accumulation of various metabolites and toxins, decreased hepatic synthesis of coagulation factors, complements, and lipoproteins, an overwhelming systemic immune response triggered by the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and hepatocyte death leading to the release of damage-associated molecular patterns like DNA, histones, and HMB-GB1. Now, management strategy should aim to restore and preserve vital organ function and mitigate or limit the progression of multi-organ failure until either there is spontaneous liver generation or emergency liver transplant is done. Hence, an effective liver assist procedure may improve survival in those who cannot undergo liver transplantation despite the poor prognostic scores and also provide greater stability while the patient is awaiting a liver transplant. Now, options for extracorporeal liver support are either an artificial liver assist device, bioartificial liver devices, or plasma exchange. However, the artificial and bioartificial liver assist devices have not shown mortality benefit in randomized trials. So, plasma exchange has been an established therapy for other immunological driven disorders like vasculitis, multiple sclerosis, and GBS. And for ALF, it has been done in the 1970s and 80s, which has shown the decreased severity of HE and vasopressor requirement after plasmapheresis. This cartoon shows the basic steps of plasmapheresis. The blood is drawn out from the patient and is pumped into a centrifugal machine where the different components of the blood are separated and the plasma is then removed. And instead of this plasma, replacement fluid is given, which could be either a fresh frozen plasma or colloids or crystalloids. The mechanism of action of plasmapheresis is by removal of plasma cytokines and addition molecules, replacement of plasma factors, and by immunomodulation. And this diagram shows the basic pathophysiology of ALF and the role of plasmapheresis. As we know in ALF, there's massive hepatocyte necrosis and hepatocyte death, leading to release of DAMs, which cause macrophage activation, and these cause release of pro-inflammatory mediators and activates pro-inflammatory macrophages, leading to increased inflammation and tissue damage. These inflammatory mediators then spill over to the blood, activate monocyte and neutrophils, and cause severe inflammatory response syndrome. Now, what plasmapheresis does, it removes these DAMs and other mediators, leading to an attenuated inflammatory response, decreasing inflammation and tissue damage. There are 2 types of plasmapheresis, high volume or low volume. High volume exchanges around 15% of ideal body weight, around 8 to 12 liters, and the session lasts around 9 hours. A low volume plasmapheresis exchanges 3 to 4 liters per session, and the session lasts around 2 hours. The duration of total therapy is variable. Some have used for 3 consecutive days, some have used alternative day, some have used it daily till there is clinical improvement or liver transplantation. Now, this was the first and the only randomized controlled trial looking into the aspect of plasmapheresis in high volume plasmapheresis in ALF, published by Larsen et al. In 2016. It was a multi-center study done in Denmark and UK. It enrolled 182 patients and divided them into either a standard medical therapy group or a standard medical therapy plus high volume plasmapheresis for 3 days. The primary endpoint was liver transplant-free survival during hospital stay, and the secondary endpoint was survival after liver transplantation, with or without plasmapheresis. They did a high volume plasmapheresis, exchange around 8 to 12 liters per day, and replacement was with 100% fresh frozen plasma in equivalent volume, and they did it on 3 consecutive days. Now, the authors showed that the length of stay, the number of patients undergoing transplant, the mean time to transplant, the intracranial pressure, and the lactate levels were similar in both the groups. However, the INR, ALT, bilirubin, arterial ammonia decreased significantly in the plasmapheresis group. And there was a significantly lesser number of patients in the plasmapheresis group that ultimately required renal renal replacement therapy, the mean arterial pressure increased significantly in the plasmapheresis group, and the prognostic scores like SIRS, SOFA, and CLIF-SOFA decreased significantly in the plasmapheresis group, and there was no difference in the adverse events between the two groups. Right? When they saw the survival difference, then there was significant survival advantage in the patients who underwent plasmapheresis. Then they did a subgroup analysis of patients who underwent transplantation and those who did not. And they saw that in patients who ultimately underwent liver transplantation, plasmapheresis did not have any survival advantage. But in those patients who did not undergo liver transplantation, there was a significant survival advantage with plasmapheresis. Then they analyzed another group of patients who had poor prognostic criteria and were candidates for liver transplantation but could not go liver transplantation due to contraindication. And in these subgroup of patients also, plasmapheresis had a significant survival advantage. Now, besides the survival advantage and the biochemical improvement, the authors also looked at immune cell functions in the patients who underwent plasmapheresis, and they noted that there was significantly decrease in inflammatory mediators like TNF alpha, IL-6, 8, and 10, decrease in addition molecule L-selectin, there's decreased monocyte activation and decreased angiopoietin 2. Now, this second study looked into low volume plasma exchange in ALF patients. However, it was a single center and a retrospective study included only 40 patients, 20 patients in age group, and was published in 2019. And this study was done in Germany. The authors did low volume plasma exchange around 3 to 4 liters and used around 12 units FFP. And they did it daily till there is clinical improvement or until liver transplantation. And majority of the patients, around 75%, received less than 3 procedures. The median exchange volume was 3.1 liters and the median time was 110 minutes. Now, authors noted significant improvement in the mean arterial pressure, inotrope support, lactate levels, GCS score, ammonia, INR, and ALT levels. However, there was no difference in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, PF ratio, creatinine, and bilirubin levels. There was significant improvement in the prognostic scores in the plasmapheresis group, but there was no survival difference between the two groups. Now, this systematic review was published last year, and they included 29 studies who did plasmapheresis for ALF. Now, authors noted that the patients who underwent plasmapheresis reported improvement in their survival who did not underwent liver transplantation, and there was improvement in survival days. There was definite biochemical improvement with plasmapheresis, but this improvement did not directly relate to mortality benefit. When they compared standard versus high volume plasmapheresis, the authors noted that there was heterogeneity in the amount of plasma exchange among various studies. Majority used only low volume, that is 2 to 4 liter of plasma for replacement, but these were mainly case control or cohort study, and the present evidence favored high volume plasmapheresis as compared to a low volume one. They also compared FFP versus albumin and saw that most of the studies used 100% FFP and only a few studies used albumin or plasma substitute. And there was no head-to-head trial between various substitutes for replacement. With respect to etiology-specific outcome, the authors noted that case series have reported better survival in patients with paracetamol-induced ALF, but the level of evidence was not strong. And there was better survival in the non-viral group as compared to the viral group. So the authors finally concluded that the level of evidence for use of high-volume plasmapheresis in selected ALF cases is high, but further well-designed RCTs will need to be carried out to ascertain the optimal duration and amount of plasma exchange required. So what do the guidelines say? The American Society of Apheresis gives a grade 1A recommendation for high-volume plasma exchange, but only a weak grade 2 recommendation for the use of any non-high-volume plasma exchange in ALF, given the lack of robust data for a low-volume exchange. The European Association of Study of Liver states that plasma exchange has been shown to improve transplant-free survival and to modulate immune dysfunction, and it may be of greater benefit in patients who are treated early and who will not ultimately undergo liver transplant. Now, the NASL guidelines published last year states that for patients with ALF who are not undergoing liver transplant, high-volume plasma exchange may be considered as a treatment options for improving survival. And based on the anti-inflammatory and ammonia lowering effect, plasmapheresis may be recommended as a bridge for patients undergoing liver transplantation if transplant is going to be delayed. And based on the current evidence, the standard volume plasmapheresis can at best be recommended only as a bridge to transplant. So in our case, we had consultation with the transfusion medicine unit. We wanted to do a high volume plasma exchange because of the weak recommendation for a standard or low volume plasma exchange. But our transfusion medicine unit wanted to do a standard volume. So we reviewed the literature and finally did a standard volume and low volume plasma exchange because of following points. Because there was no particular guidelines for plasma exchange in pregnancy, and there's limited literature on plasma exchange for ALF in pregnancy. And whatever data that was available, whether for a hepatic or non-hepatic indications for plasmapheresis, they had done a low volume exchange. Now to our second topic, antivirals in pregnancy. First, if you review the role of antivirals in ALF, then it is generally agreed that hepatitis B is a non-cytopathic virus. Therefore, the most of the liver injury that occurs in ALF is by the vigorous host immune response rather than the virus itself. So the efficacy of nucleotide analogs for patients with B-related ALF is uncertain. But the survival of these patients who do not undergo liver transplant is low, around 19 to 33%. So there have been studies which had looked into this aspect of antivirals in ALF in the last 1 to 2 decades. And what these studies noted that the patients who were given antivirals, there was definite biochemical and clinical improvement. There was decreased DNA levels, but the mortality benefit was uncertain. And in one study, they noted that the mortality benefit was limited to only those patients in which the antivirals were started early before the onset of SARS. But the most definite indication for antivirals is for viral suppression in these potential liver transplant candidates to prevent the recurrence of hepatitis B after transplantation. Now, the guidelines, the INACIL gives only a weak recommendation for use of this nucleotide analogs in ALF because of the low evidence. And the American Association Study of Liver Diseases gives only a reasonable option in these B-related ALF patients because of the lack of observed benefit. But they also recommended due to the need for liver transplant, potential liver transplant candidates to reduce the risk of recurrent hepatitis B. Now, hepatitis B in pregnancy. Hepatitis B infection in pregnancy has implications for both mother and the fetus. For mother, there is potential flare and decompensation. Then there's effect of Hep B on pregnancy and vice versa. Then there's a dilemma whether to treat or not. And if treatment is to be given, when to start treatment. For fetus, the main concerns is of teratogenicity due to the antiviral, and then there is the risk of mother-to-child transmission of hepatitis B. Now, if you look at the impact of pregnancy in hepatitis B, the pregnancy is an immunotolerant state, and there is depressed cell-mediated immunity. And after acute infection, it is seen that loss of surface antigen is less likely in pregnant as compared to a non-pregnant woman. And pregnancy is believed to be a risk factor for development of chronic Hep B if acute exposure occurs during pregnancy. Now, if you see the impact of hepatitis B on pregnancy, an acute Hep B infection is associated with gestational diabetes, increased postpartum hemorrhage, preterm delivery, and low birth weights. If we see the risk of decompensated hepatitis B cirrhosis in pregnancy, then there is high rates of spontaneous abortion, fetal prematurity, life-threatening varicose bleeding, liver failure, and postpartum hemorrhage. And if HCC develops in such a situation, then it is more aggressive and has worse outcome. Now, available antivirals that we have out of these, the telbuvudine and tenofovir are FDA category B, and the lamivudine, entecavir, and entecavir are FDA category C. Main side effects with lamivudine are pancreatitis and lactic acidosis. With telbuvudine is myopathy, creatine kinase, and lactic acidosis. And with tenofovir, side effects include nephropathy, Fanconi syndrome, osteomalacia, and lactic acidosis. So, which pregnant patients need to be treated? There are basically two criteria. First, if the patient meets the standard indications for hepatitis B therapy, as in a normal patient, then initiation or continuation of antiviral therapy is mandatory because it prevents acute exacerbation of hepatitis B and also prevents a decompensated liver disease. A second indication is for prevention of mother-to-child transmission, especially if the mother is highly viremic and is E antigen positive. An antiviral is to be given in third trimester, and they are safe and effective. An additional indication could be due to the acute exacerbation of chronic Hep B, in which the ALTs are more than 5 times, especially if advanced fibrosis is present. The risk of mother-to-child transmission is highest in the third trimester, especially around the birth, and is believed to be due to the exposure of maternal blood and cervical secretions, and is also dependent on maternal DNA levels. And in acute hepatitis B during pregnancy, it is seen that it is highest, the mother-to-child transmission is highest if the mother acquires acute Hep B in the third trimester as compared to the first trimester. So in an E antigen negative with low viremia, there's 10% risk of transmission without immunoprophylaxis at birth. But if the mother is E antigen positive with very high viral loads, then there's a 90% risk if immunoprophylaxis is not given at birth. So most of the guidelines recommend treatment in the third trimester at around 28 to 32 weeks for prevention of mother-to-child transmission. And the threshold DNA threshold level is more than 2 lakhs in ASLD and EASL, and it is, and for Apasol it is 10 to 10^7 international unit per ml. And the drug of choice is tenofovir with lamivudine and telbuvudine as alternative. So in our case, we started her on tenofovir because there are limited therapeutic options as LT was refused, and tenofovir has proven safety in pregnancy and also for prevention of mother-to-child transmission. Now, recently, literature has also come up regarding safety of tenofovir alafenamide in pregnancy. One of the study was published last year, and it stated that TAF is safe for highly viremic mothers, and there is no safety concerns for either the mother or the fetus. Yes, another study similarly stated that TAF is safe, similar in efficacy to TDF, and the mother-to-child transmission rate is 0%. So to summarize my talk, the therapeutic plasma exchange has definite survival advantage, especially if the patient is not supposed to undergo liver transplantation, and in some cases can also be used as a bridge to liver transplantation. It improves biochemical parameters. There's decreased inflammation, but there's only high-grade evidence for high volume plasmapheresis with FFP as replacement fluid. With regards to antivirals in AL, they provide, despite the clinical and biochemical improvement they provide, mortality benefit is uncertain, and there's low-grade evidence with only weak recommendation in B-related ALF. But the most definite indication is for viral suppression in these potential liver transplant candidates. With respect to antivirals in pregnancy, tenofovir is safe and drug of choice, and it is to be started or continued if indicated for chronic Hep B, advanced fibrosis or cirrhosis. And for prevention of mother-to-child transmission, it is to be started in first trimester in highly viremic E antigen positive mothers, along with active passive immunization of baby at birth. Thank you.
So we have a couple of questions.
Sir, do we have time for some questions?
Yeah, we can take 5 minutes.
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll do that. So, Akshay, there are a few questions here.
Yes.
One of the comment is that how do you differentiate between the reactivation and the acute liver failure that sir had already asked? So, can you repeat it and make it a little more clear?
Yes, sir. First of all, if clinically or historically we get evidence that the patient has chronic liver disease or jaundice in the past, or there's history, then we can get a clue that it is a reactivation. Secondly, if we see the IgM anti-HB core, these are high in acute Hep B patients as compared to reactivation. And the IgM anti-HB core is of high molecular weight in acute Hep B as compared to chronic Hep B. It is a 19S IgM anti-HB core in acute, and it is 9S in chronic reactivation. And if we see the DNA levels, those can also be used for differentiation. If it is more than 5.2 log units, then it is a case of reactivation. And in acute Hep B, these are usually less than 3.2 log units.
Yeah, but then it may not be. It may not be very easy to differentiate between the two.
Yes.
Even
yes.
when you have high. Yeah.
Yes.
And somebody pointed out that could it be acute and chronic liver failure?
So we didn't have any evidence of chronicity. So the sonography did not show any portal hypertensive changes. Even the Doppler was normal. So the sonography Doppler for portal vein.
Okay, so for acute and chronic liver failure, you need to have some evidence of chronic liver failure, which even on follow-up we couldn't get one.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
Now, few questions about the differential diagnosis. So people are asking about autoimmune hepatitis. Could this be autoimmune hepatitis, Wilson's disease, or pregnancy-related liver disease be discussed in differential diagnosis?
So the acute fatty liver of pregnancy and HELP usually come in the late third trimester, and there was also no history of her blood pressure was normal. There was no history of hypertension.
Yeah.
And since we had a definite evidence of B-related illness, and her globulins was normal, and there was no history. Otherwise, history suggestive of autoimmune disorder. So we didn't think of that.
Akshay, there's a question on difference between plasmapheresis and plasma exchange. These terms are often used interchangeably, but can you clarify what is plasma exchange and what is plasmapheresis?
So plasmapheresis is basically a technique of segregating the different blood components. Like we have plasma, we have RBCs, and you have WBCs. Plasmapheresis is basically separating these components. And plasma exchange is when we remove the plasma and exchange it with a replacement fluid, which could either be a plasma or an albumin or different crystalloid solution.
So if actually when we are doing the procedures, usually it is plasma exchange. Plasmapheresis usually means that you remove some component of plasma and don't exchange it. So usually up to 15% if you remove, you call it a plasmapheresis. Whereas if you remove more than that, you need to replace, and then it becomes a plasma exchange.
Yes.
All right. What are the other questions? There was a question as that.
So there was one more question. How did you?
Yeah. So my question, and I think this was asked in the chat box also, is that we know about King's College criteria for liver transplantation, but when do you start thinking about plasmapheresis?
So there's
Is there
no
criteria?
definite. So there's no definite laid down guideline or criteria as to when to intervene. But we have certain prognostic scores like the King's College criteria, Alfred score, all the MELD score, with which we can gauge whether the patient has a poor prognosis or not. Like the Alfred score, which we have, and the INASL guideline also recommend its use. If it's a basically a dynamic score which we can calculate every day, and if on day 3 the Alfred score is more than 3, then there's a 70% chance of mortality. So similarly, a MELD score, if it is more than 33, then it is a poor prognostic criteria, and we should start thinking of liver transplant. So,
In a situation where you don't have liver transplantation, is there a role for N-acetylcysteine in this situation?
So the recent NASL guidelines have recommended the use of NAC in ALF patients, but it is only useful if it is given early on, like in grade 1 or 2 hepatic encephalopathy. So there's a role of NAC given for 3 days, not in high grade HE like grade 3 and 4. So.
So there are some other questions also. Yeah. So there are some other questions also, Akshay.
Yes.
When to start antiviral in pregnancy? Which trimester you have already referred to?
Yes.
And another one is any recommendations on dual drug therapy in ALF due to hepatitis B?
So dual drug therapy in hepatitis B.
ALF due to
topic
ALF.
of day.
Yeah.
No, so I couldn't find any literature regarding. I'm not aware of any literature, but definitely in Hep B, then there's definitely a discussion regarding dual antivirals, especially if the viral load is high. Then dual antivirals are better than single antivirals, but not
Okay.
particularly for ALF. I'm not aware. Sir.
So if the patient comes in acute hepatitis B and not acute liver failure, do you have any indication for treating such patients?
With antivirals, sir.
Yeah, acute Hep B, not ALF due to hepatitis B.
So the trials which have been done did show biochemical improvement, but the mortality benefit was uncertain with antivirals. So, and there's only a weak recommendation, especially in liver failure patients. Sir. So if
Yes.
it is only acute Hep B without liver failure, then probably antivirals are not required.
So probably if it is a severe acute hepatitis B,
yes, sir.
and it is not improving and the DNA is pretty high, then you may treat with antivirals also.
Yes, and there's another indication, sir. If the jaundice is persisting beyond 4 weeks, then we could think of antivirals. Sir. There's a persistent illness more than 4 weeks.
Akshay, there's a question about Dialive as one of the modality for treatment. Do you have any comment or any knowledge about Dialive system of support, liver support?
Dialyze.
Yeah, Dialive.
Yes.
It's a support system which I think Dr. Jalan has initiated. It's a sort of a filter system. So it's a 2-filter system in which you remove the toxins and you remove the albumin. I think somebody asked a question of what is the relationship between plasmapheresis and Dialive. I think they're 2 different mechanisms altogether.
Yes. So sorry, sir, I'm not aware of that.
Yeah.
So we sell.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Harsh.
The patient doesn't can afford a liver transplant, but it is not available. Then how to go about such patient? So do you have any experience with plasmapheresis and acute liver failure?
We have not done plasmapheresis for acute hepatitis B, but we have done for many other indications acute liver. I think our experience is mixed. We have found some cases which have responded, some cases which have not responded. It all depends on the reversibility of the underlying disease or ultimate doing of liver transplant.
Thank you, sir.
So, any final comments by Dr. Anurag or Dr. Udhavan? Otherwise, we'll move on and close the session.
No, sir, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity. We're very sorry for this snag that we had. And we
Always
needed
happy.
everyone. And
A few questions.
Harsh, you were saying something?
Yeah, I think there are a few questions that were unanswered earlier in the US part. So
Yeah,
they
but
said
then we are
somebody asked about
already
rose.
crossed the time,
Yeah.
Harsh, and they have to
Yes,
use
sir.
the-
Yes, sir. It's okay, sir.
So we will
It's okay,
possibly
sir.
have to
Thank
wind
you.
up here. I thank both Anurag